The drill sergeant slammed his clipboard to the ground. "Washed up. Weak, a goddamn charity case." She said nothing, just stood there, in regulation boots and standard fatigues, her blonde hair pulled into a tight knot, face blank. This was Fort Braxton, where the top 1% of soldiers fight to survive training. And she looked like a nurse who got lost. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez circled her like a wolf. 40 elite recruits smirked, waiting for her to break. But she didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. Then he grabbed her shoulder. In one motion, she twisted his wrist, slammed him to the dirt, and whispered something into his ear. His eyes widened. He scrambled to stand, then saluted. No one laughed after that, not when they saw what was inked behind her ear, a serpent coiled around a black dagger. Only Ghost Viper operatives had that mark. But what they didn't know about this quiet woman would change everything. Why wasn't she fighting back? In 48 hours, grown men would be standing at attention, tears streaming down their faces as they learned the truth about the soldier they'd dismissed as weak. Some secrets are worth more than silence, and Grace Mitchell carried one that would shatter every assumption about what strength really looks like. Fort Braxton Elite Training Academy stood like a fortress against the North Carolina sky, its Spartan barracks housing 40 of America's most promising military minds. At 0500 hours, the compound erupted with the sounds of combat boots hitting gravel, drill instructors barking orders, and the rhythmic counting of push-ups echoing across the training grounds. This wasn't just another military facility, it was where careers were made or destroyed, where the difference between good and legendary was measured in seconds and millimeters. Grace Mitchell arrived on a Tuesday, the last trainee to report, carrying a standard-issue duffel bag and wearing the same olive-drab fatigues as everyone else. No fanfare announced her arrival, no special introduction marked her entrance. She simply appeared at the barracks door, scanned the room with those unnervingly calm blue eyes, and claimed the only remaining bunk, bottom rack, farthest from the door, the spot nobody wanted. The other 39 soldiers barely glanced up from their gear prep, already dismissing her as someone who'd wash out within the week. Staff Sergeant Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez had built his reputation on breaking people. 15 years of service had carved him into a mountain of muscle and conviction, with shoulders that could fill a doorway and a voice that could shake windows. He believed in the old ways, the hard ways, the ways that had supposedly made America's military the finest fighting force on earth. Women, in his not-so-personal opinion, were a political accommodation that weakened the warrior culture he'd devoted his life to protecting. Tank had never seen real combat, a fact he compensated for with volume and vitriol. Commander Patricia Hayes watched it all from her office window, her 25 years of service evident in the web of lines around her eyes and the measured way she moved through the world. She kept detailed files on every trainee, knew their histories, their potential, their weaknesses. But Grace Mitchell's file was different, thinner than the others. Gaps where there should have been details, redactions where there should have been assignments. Hayes had seen enough classified documents to recognize when someone was being deliberately obscured. The daily routine at Fort Braxton was designed to break down and rebuild. Physical training began before dawn, followed by weapons drills, tactical exercises, psychological evaluations, and classroom instruction that pushed minds as hard as bodies. Every moment was observed, every action evaluated, every weakness cataloged. The hierarchy wasn't just maintained, it was weaponized, with public praise and humiliation serving as tools to forge these raw soldiers into something harder, sharper, more lethal. Grace moved through it all like water through rocks. She completed every task with quiet competence, never excelling enough to draw positive attention, never failing enough to warrant correction. She spoke only when directly addressed, ate alone, and disappeared during the brief recreational periods. The others started calling her Ghost, not as a compliment, but as a dismissal of someone who barely seemed to exist. They didn't notice the way she held her rifle with the unconscious familiarity of someone who'd carried one for years. They didn't see how her eyes tracked every entrance and exit, or how she positioned herself with clear sightlines at all times. Tank noticed her silence and mistook it for weakness. Each day his comments grew sharper, his corrections more public. "Mitchell?" he'd bellow across the training ground. "My grandmother moves faster than you, and she's been dead 10 years. The other soldiers would laugh, grateful the target wasn't them. Grace would simply nod, adjust, and continue. Her lack of response only fueled Tank's conviction that she didn't belong there. By the end of the first week, he'd made her his special project, the example of everything wrong with the modern military. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you look? Grace's reaction to Tank's escalating campaign would puzzle everyone. When he announced a special evaluation exercise designed to weed out the unfit, she did something none of them expected. She smiled. Tank called it Operation Weakness, and he'd designed it with the specific intention of public humiliation. The obstacle course stretched across 200 meters of Fort Braxton's most challenging terrain. Walls to scale, ropes to climb, mud pits to crawl through, and barriers that required both strength and strategy to overcome. Standard completion time for elite soldiers was 12 minutes. Tank set Grace's limit at 8, loaded her pack with an extra 20 pounds of gear, and handed her the most battered equipment from the supply shed. The entire training company gathered to watch what everyone assumed would be a spectacular failure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tank announced through his megaphone, his voice dripping with false concern, "today we'll witness what happens when political correctness meets military reality. Mitchell here thinks she belongs among warriors. Let's see if she can even finish the course designed for real soldiers." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some laughing nervously, others exchanging glances that suggested Tank might be pushing too far. Grace said nothing. She simply stripped down to her tank top in the 40-degree morning air, revealing arms corded with lean muscle and a back mapped with scars that told stories none of them could read. The starting pistol cracked. Grace exploded forward with a speed that made Tank's smirk falter. She hit the first wall at full sprint, using momentum to carry her up and over in one fluid motion. The rope climb that typically took soldiers 30 seconds, she ascended it in 12, her movements so efficient they looked almost lazy. Through the mud pit, under the barbed wire, over the barriers, each obstacle fell before her like dominoes. But she didn't look back. The crowd's jeers died in their throats as the timer displayed numbers that shouldn't have been possible. 7 minutes, 14 seconds. The training ground fell silent except for the sound of Grace's controlled breathing. She wasn't even winded. Tank's face had gone from red to white, his mouth working soundlessly as he tried to process what he'd just witnessed. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then oppressive. Soldiers who'd been placing bets on how quickly she'd quit were now fumbling for explanations. Equipment malfunction, timer error, some kind of trick? The moment shattered when a black SUV pulled up to the training ground, its government plates and tinted windows marking it as someone important. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison stepped out, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. Reaper Morrison was a legend, the kind of officer whose stories were told in hushed voices, whose missions were classified before they even began. He'd been shot 4 times, captured twice, and had personally led operations that existed only in redacted files. Every soldier there straightened unconsciously as he approached. Morrison's eyes swept across the training ground, past Tank, past the assembled soldiers, and locked onto Grace. His expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, and then something that looked remarkably like awe. He crossed the distance between them in quick strides, and what happened next would be burned into the memory of everyone present. Lieutenant Colonel James Reaper Morrison, decorated warrior and living legend, snapped to attention and delivered a parade ground perfect salute to the woman they'd all been mocking. "Ma'am," his voice carried across the silent training ground, "it's an honor to serve with you again." Grace returned the salute with the same precision, her expression remaining neutral. "Thank you, Colonel," she said simply, then turned and walked toward the barracks as if nothing unusual had happened. Behind her, 40 jaws hung open, minds racing to recalculate everything they thought they knew. Tank's authority, built on volume and intimidation, crumbled in real time as soldiers began whispering among themselves. "Who is she?" The question rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Tank, desperate to salvage his position, turned on Morrison with barely contained fury. "Colonel, I don't know what kind of favoritism game you're playing, But this is my training ground, and that woman—" Morrison's look cut him off mid-sentence. It was the kind of look that had probably preceded violence in less civilized settings. Morrison sat up. "Sergeant Rodriguez?" Morrison's voice was quiet but carried clearly. "You have no idea who you've been talking to, do you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Tank's belligerence wavered, uncertainty creeping into his features. Around them, soldiers were pulling out phones, trying to search for information, finding nothing. Grace Mitchell apparently didn't exist in any accessible database, but the way Morrison had looked at her, the way he'd saluted, that wasn't protocol, that was respect. The kind earned in places where respect was paid for in blood. Have you ever witnessed someone's true skills shock everyone around them? Commander Hayes emerged from the administrative building, a manila folder clutched in her hands, her expression grim. "All personnel conference room. Now." Her voice brooked no argument. As the soldiers filed toward the building, casting glances back at the now empty obstacle course, one thing was clear. Grace Mitchell was not who they thought she was. What Hayes found in that classified file would change everything they thought they knew about elite soldiers. The conference room filled with the electric tension of 40 soldiers trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Commander Hayes stood at the front, her usual composed demeanor cracked by something that looked like reverence. Beside her, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison waited with the patience of a man who'd learned to be still in sniper hides and enemy territory. Grace stood apart from the group, back straight, eyes forward, as if she were somewhere else entirely. Tank pushed his way to the front, his face mottled with rage and confusion, still trying to assert an authority that everyone could feel slipping away. "Quiet," Hayes commanded, though the room was already silent. She opened the manila folder with hands that weren't quite steady. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. The only reason you're hearing it is because Colonel Morrison believes you need to understand who you've been training alongside." She paused, looking directly at Tank. "Who some of you have been systematically attempting to break." The words landed like a slap. Tank's jaw worked, but no sound came out. Morrison stepped forward, his bearing shifting from soldier to storyteller, though his tale would be far from fiction. "Ladies and gentlemen, meet Widow 27. The call sign meant nothing to most of them, but a few of the more experienced soldiers went pale. Widow 27 was a ghost story, a legend whispered in forward operating bases and special operations briefings. The operator who'd done the impossible, who'd survived the unsurvivable. Master Sergeant Grace Mitchell, Morrison continued, 47 confirmed kills, 12 successful extractions from territories you're not cleared to know existed, and the only living recipient of a medal so classified we can't even name it in this room." The revelation hit the room like a concussion grenade. Soldiers who'd laughed at her stumbles during training were trying to reconcile the quiet woman with the statistics Morrison was listing. 4 bronze stars, 3 purple hearts, a silver star with Valor device, commendations from allied nations whose operations didn't officially exist. The list went on, each achievement more impossible than the last, but Morrison wasn't done. His voice dropped, taking on the weight of personal memory. Afghanistan, October 2019. Operation Silent Thunder. Several soldiers recognized the name. It was taught in advanced tactics courses as an example of mission planning gone catastrophically wrong. Grace led a 6-person team into Taliban-controlled mountains to extract a captured diplomat. Intel was compromised. They walked into an ambush. Morrison's voice roughened. "I was running Overwatch from Bagram. I listened to the radio traffic as her team was cut down one by one. Listened to her calling in danger close air support on her own position. Listened to her go silent for 72 hours. The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming. Grace hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, but tears were tracking silently down her face. Morrison continued, his own voice not entirely steady. When the QRF finally reached the position, they found 23 enemy KIA. They found 5 American heroes who died defending that hilltop. And they found Grace, barely alive, having crawled 15 miles through enemy territory with the diplomat on her back. Both of them shot, both of them nearly dead from exposure. She'd tourniqueted his wounds with strips from her own uniform. She'd kept him alive on nothing but willpower and whatever God watches over warriors like her. Tank had gone from red to white to something approaching green. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water as the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. He'd been publicly humiliating someone who'd bled for freedoms he'd only pretended to defend. Around him, other soldiers were having similar revelations. The woman they'd called Ghost and Quota had earned her silence in ways they couldn't even imagine. A few of the veterans in the room had already come to attention, rendering salutes that Grace acknowledged with the slightest nod. "Show them," Morrison said quietly. Grace hesitated for the first time since anyone had met her. Then, slowly, she turned around and lifted the back of her shirt. The room gasped collectively. Her entire back was a canvas of remembrance, names and dates tattooed in precise military script. David Chen, Kenneth Williams, Maria Santos, James Tucker, Robert Kim. Her team. Her family. Below their names, coordinates that every tactician in the room recognized as some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. At the center, a black widow spider, its hourglass marking the color of dried blood. Never forgotten, curved beneath it, all in Gothic script. "I tried to quit," Grace spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite the tears. "They wouldn't let me. Said the best way to honor my team was to train the next generation. Said I could save lives by teaching what I'd learned." She turned back to face them, and 40 trained killers found they couldn't meet her eyes. "I came here to hide, to try to be nobody again. Tank was right about one thing. I am a failure. I failed to bring my team home." The conference room erupted. Veterans pushed forward to salute properly. Younger soldiers stammered apologies. Tank tried to speak, to explain, to justify, but the words died under the weight of collective contempt from his former supporters. He'd become a pariah in the span of 10 minutes, his toxic leadership style exposed as the shallow posturing it had always been. Grace accepted the apologies with quiet grace, but offered no absolution. She simply stood there, finally revealed, carrying her ghosts with a dignity that made everyone else feel small. "What would you do if you discovered you'd been disrespecting a war hero?" Morrison wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone, showing a message that had just arrived. "Speaking of saving lives," he said, his professional mask sliding back into place, "we have a situation developing 30 miles from here. Hostage scenario, children involved. Local SWAT is overwhelmed." He looked at Grace, and everyone saw the moment she transformed from broken survivor to weapon. "Ma'am, they need someone with your particular skills." The test of Grace's true character was just beginning. The operations center at Fort Braxton transformed into a hive of controlled chaos within minutes. Monitors flickered to life, showing aerial footage of Jefferson Elementary School, where 17 children and 3 teachers were being held by an armed group whose demands kept escalating. Local SWAT had established a perimeter, but were out of their depth. The hostage-takers were using military tactics, suggesting training that went beyond typical criminal behavior. Commander Hayes stood before the tactical display, her expression grim. Beside her, Morrison worked the phones, calling in resources, and in the corner, Grace Mitchell stood perfectly still, watching the screens with the 1,000-yard stare of someone seeing past the present into all the ways this could go wrong. "I'm not doing this," Grace said quietly, but her voice carried. The room stopped. 40 soldiers, who'd just learned what she was capable of, watched her shake her head. "I'm done leading people to their deaths." The words hung heavy in the recycled air. Morrison started to speak, but Hayes raised a hand. This wasn't something that could be ordered or commanded. This was about choice, about stepping back into a nightmare she'd barely survived the first time. The silence stretched until one of the younger soldiers, Private Chen, stepped forward. "Ma'am?" His voice cracked slightly. "Those kids need you. We need you." One by one, others joined him. Not the bravado-filled chest-thumping that Tank had inspired, but quiet affirmations from soldiers who finally understood what real leadership looked like. They'd seen her times on the obstacle course, witnessed Morrison's respect, heard the roll call of her fallen team. Now they were asking her to trust them, the way her previous team had trusted her. Grace's jaw worked as she fought an internal battle visible to everyone watching. Finally, her shoulders squared. The transformation was instant and absolute, from traumatized survivor to battlefield commander. "Intel first," her voice snapped with authority that made everyone straighten unconsciously. "I need building schematics, number of hostiles, weapons assessment, and psychological profiles if we have them. Chin, Davis, Martinez, you're my intelligence cell. Get me everything." They scattered to terminals without hesitation. "Morrison, I need an entry team. Not your strongest, your smartest. People who can think when plans go sideways." She moved to the tactical display, her mind already 3 steps ahead. "And somebody get Tank out of my sight before I demonstrate some of the close-quarters combat techniques they don't teach in basic." Tank slunk from the room, his 15-year career effectively over. No one watched him go. They were too busy watching Grace orchestrate a precision operation with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this dozens of times. She processed information at a speed that left staff officers scrambling to keep up, identified weaknesses in the hostage-takers' positions that surveillance had missed, and began building a plan that prioritized lives over glory. Every movement was economical, every decision calculated. This was what mastery looked like. "Ma'am," Chin called from his terminal, "I've got something. The lead hostage-taker facial recognition puts him as Marcus Webb, dishonorably discharged 3 years ago for extremist affiliations. He applied for Special Forces selection twice, failed the psychological evaluation both times." Grace nodded, filing the information. A wannabe who thought he had something to prove, the most dangerous kind of amateur, skilled enough to do it. She turned to the assembled volunteers, seeing past their ranks and records to what actually mattered. "This isn't about being heroes," she said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Heroes get people killed. This is about precision, discipline, and bringing everyone home. My last team thought they were heroes. Now their name's on my back." The brutal honesty hit harder than any motivational speech. "If you follow my lead, if you do exactly what I say, when I say it, we'll get those kids out. But I need to know you understand. This isn't a movie. When bullets start flying, your instinct will be to protect yourself. You'll need to override that. Can you do that?" The volunteers nodded, and Grace saw something in their eyes that made her believe them, not the false bravado of untested soldiers, but the quiet determination of people who understood the stakes. She began assigning roles with the precision of a chess master positioning pieces. Overwatch positions, entry points, contingency plans for contingencies. Every soldier got a job that matched their skills and, more importantly, their temperament. Those who'd mocked her silence now hung on every word. The transformation in the room was complete. Where hours ago these soldiers had seen a weak link to be ridiculed, they now saw a master practitioner of the art of war. Grace's hands moved over the tactical display, choreographing violence with the delicacy of a conductor leading a symphony. She'd identified 3 entry points, 2 distraction operations, and a psychological pressure campaign that would push the hostage-takers exactly where she wanted them. It was brilliant, it was terrifying, it was exactly what those children needed. "Have you ever had to step up when others were counting on you?" Grace looked at her makeshift team, seeing echoes of the soldiers she'd lost. The difference was, this time she knew the cost. This time she could prepare them for the reality behind the romance. "Gear up," she ordered. "We move in 2 hours. And remember, those kids are counting on us to be better than our fear." As the team scattered to prepare, Morrison approached. "You know you don't have to do this," he said quietly. Grace's smile was sharp as a blade. "That's where you're wrong, Colonel. This is exactly what I have to do." What happened next would define Grace's legacy forever. The operation unfolded with the precision of a Swiss watch. Grace's team moved through Jefferson Elementary like shadows, each member executing their role flawlessly. The psychological pressure campaign had worked exactly as planned. The hostage-takers, convinced they were surrounded by a much larger force, had consolidated in the cafeteria just as Grace had predicted. 2 hours and 17 minutes after the first breach, all 17 children and 3 teachers emerged unharmed. The hostage-takers were in custody, not a single shot fired. It was textbook perfect, the kind of operation that would be studied in tactical courses for years to come. But the real revelation was yet to come. Back at Fort Braxton, as the adrenaline faded and the team gathered for debrief, Commander Hayes stood before them with an expression none of them could read. "Outstanding work," she began, then paused. "All of you, especially those of you who showed character under pressure, who protected others when it mattered, who learned from your mistakes." Her eyes moved deliberately from face to face. "Which brings me to why Master Sergeant Mitchell is really here." The room tensed. Grace, cleaning her weapon with mechanical precision, didn't look up. Hayes continued. "This wasn't random. This wasn't about her hiding or healing. This was her final mission." The words landed like a bombshell. Morrison stepped forward, adding his voice to the revelation. 6 months ago, the Pentagon identified a critical problem. We're losing the next generation of warriors to toxic leadership, outdated training methods, and a culture that values volume over competence. We needed someone to identify the future leaders, the ones who could adapt, who could think, who could inspire through action rather than intimidation. We needed someone who could see past the surface to what really matters. He gestured to Grace. "We needed Widow 27. Grace finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "Every stumble, every moment of silence, every time I let Tank target me. I was watching who laughed, who looked uncomfortable, who tried to quietly help, watching who put completing the mission above personal glory, who adapted when plans changed, who protected their teammates even when it cost them." She stood, moving to face the assembled soldiers. "I've been writing evaluations since day one. Not about your PT scores or your marksmanship, about your character." The revelation recontextualized everything. Her silence hadn't been weakness, it had been observation. Her isolation hadn't been antisocial behavior, it had been assessment. She'd been a wolf among sheep, but not hunting, selecting, testing, measuring. Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably, remembering moments they'd shown their true colors, for better or worse. Tank's systematic campaign of humiliation had been the perfect catalyst, revealing who would stand up to authority when it was wrong, who would follow along, who would actively participate in cruelty. "Private Chen," Grace called out. The young soldier straightened. "Day 3, you slipped me an extra protein bar when Tank ordered reduced rations. You thought no one saw." Chen flushed. "Specialist Martinez, you consistently paired with struggling teammates during exercises, even though it lowered your own scores. Lieutenant Morrison, you questioned Tank's methods privately with Commander Hayes 4 times. One by one, she revealed moments of character that the soldiers thought had gone unnoticed. Small acts of courage, integrity, compassion. The qualities that actually mattered when lives were on the line. I've selected 5 of you for a new program," Grace announced. "Not the strongest or the fastest, not the ones with the best records or the most commendations. The ones who showed me they could be trusted with other people's lives." She listed the names, and they weren't who anyone expected. The quiet ones, mostly. The ones who'd focused on the mission instead of personal advancement. The ones who'd shown growth, who'd learned from mistakes, who'd put team before ego. They were the future Grace had been sent to find. Tank's fate became clear in that moment. He hadn't just been humiliating a war hero, he'd been failing the most important test of his career. His toxic leadership, his bullying, his inability to recognize true strength when it stood before him had been carefully documented. Within hours, he'd receive orders for mandatory retirement, his methods deemed incompatible with the military's future. He'd become a case study in what not to do, a cautionary tale told in leadership courses about the danger of confusing volume with authority, cruelty with strength. Grace's final address to the camp was brief but powerful. Standing before the assembled company in the morning light, her back tattoo visible through her tank top, she spoke about leadership, about sacrifice, about the true meaning of strength. "The silence of an experienced person is worth more than 1,000 boasts from someone who's never truly fought," she said. "Remember that. In combat, in life, the loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous. Learn to recognize quiet competence. Learn to value character over charisma. Learn that true strength protects the vulnerable instead of exploiting them." What assumptions have you made about quiet people in your life? As the sun climbed higher, Grace packed her few belongings with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown in everything else. No ceremony marked her departure. No fanfare announced her next mission. She simply walked to the waiting vehicle where her selected 5 were already loaded, ready for whatever came next. The remaining soldiers watched her go, understanding finally that they'd been in the presence of something rare. A true warrior who measured victory not in bodies dropped, but in lives saved, futures shaped, potential realized. The barracks felt different after she left. Her bunk, made with military precision, held a single piece of paper. "Never underestimate the quiet ones," it read in her precise handwriting. Below that, coordinates. Not to a battlefield or a tactical position, but to Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60, where her team lay waiting for their next visit. The message was clear. Honor came not from volume or visibility, but from service, sacrifice, and the willingness to bear witness to those who'd given everything. Commander Hayes would later tell investigators that Grace Mitchell's assessment had identified not just 5 future leaders, but a fundamental shift needed in military culture. The report she filed would reshape training programs across all branches, emphasizing character assessment alongside physical prowess. Emotional intelligence would become as valued as tactical knowledge. The age of Tank Rodriguez was ending. The age of quiet professionals like Grace Mitchell had begun. Somewhere, in a location known only to a handful of people with the highest security clearances, Grace was already preparing the next generation of warriors, not to be the loudest or the strongest, but to be the kind of leaders who could inspire through action, who could carry others through the darkness, who understood that true strength whispers while weakness shouts. Grace disappeared into the morning mist, but her legend lives on in every soldier who learned that true strength whispers while weakness shouts. In training grounds across the country, instructors would tell the story of Widow 27, the operator who'd lost everything and chosen to transform that loss into purpose. They'd speak of the silence that spoke volumes, the competence that needed no announcement, the leadership that led by example rather than volume. And in the quiet moments before dawn, when new recruits struggled with doubt and fear, they'd remember that somewhere out there, Grace Mitchell was still watching, still selecting, still shaping the future, one quiet observation at a time.
Mình biết rằng có nhiều bạn nam đang theo dõi series này. Mình là Daisy và mình tin rằng hiểu được câu chuyện của người phụ nữ sẽ giúp chúng ta trở thành một người đàn ông tốt hơn. A Simple Woman, subscribe để khám phá nội tâm phong phú này nhé.